Welcome to Nightmares and Grief, a place to explore and celebrate the darkness. Today's episode is part 6 of my novel, To Make the World Obey. Last time, Lou Greaves found his captain Eddie dead in Jackie's apartment. Johnny Bean found the scene and called it in. Detectives Deborah Samson and Freddie Plum caught the case, and Deborah connected it to the Fred Meyer massacre and Lucinda Love. A witness handed over photos of a large man in a black van, and Deborah launched a citywide manhunt. She found him at a gas station. She shot him in the leg and beat him while he was down. Freddie had to pull her off. The man refused his legal name. He would only say, "My name is Bartu." Commissioner Hartigan stripped her of her badge and gun. When she got home, Adam and Shaylee were gone. Peaches' men had come knocking, and Adam told her he didn't know who she was anymore. What will happen now that Bartu is apprehended? Can Deborah reconcile with her family? And what's the friends' next move? Find out on To Make the World Obey. Now, settle in, check under the bed, and pour a drink for the skeletons in your closet. It's time to start. The sense of hollow impotence was strange and not entirely unfamiliar. There had been other times that Deborah had experienced the same feeling of helplessness. This feeling that there was nothing she could do to solve the problems of the world. But in those days, she'd had a bigger gun, and the rules of the world were more loosely prescribed. Deborah had the freedom to self-medicate then. She was afraid to now. When she got to her apartment, the dying cat's screech of the door sent a hairline fracture down her heart. She dropped her keys on the table beside the door and made straight for the cabinet above the refrigerator. From it, she withdrew a dusty bottle of whiskey that had retreated there long, long ago. It was sour in smell, taste, and color. And the shot went down ruthlessly. Deborah shivered. It was just what she needed. She needed roughness. She needed to fill her night with harsh things. Grabbing a squat, heavy glass with a thick base, Deborah poured a measure of the stuff and took it to the couch along with the bottle. She'd already kicked off her shoes at the door, and she rested her heels on the coffee table, stretching and spreading to take up as much space as she could. She turned on the television and flipped through the channels while sipping the whiskey. Unsurprising, there was nothing on to satisfy her. Deborah turned off the TV and tossed aside the remote, opting to scroll through her phone. But the fury and impotence distracted her. They made it impossible for her to focus on anything. Her thoughts fidgeted with agitation, moving back and forth in front of her attention like caged and irritated jaguars. They morphed from one thing to another. They shifted, moved, changed, burned, and so Deborah would launch into one distraction, only to get bored and frustrated with it and launch into another. Instagram held nothing of interest, nor did her news feed or Facebook. She scanned through Netflix and started 3 movies and a series before she gave up, resigned to her agitation. She had never been so furious with Freddie. She was engulfed with horror because of her suspension. No longer allowed on the case, no longer permitted to investigate what she perceived was her responsibility to fix. It mortified her. Left out of her hands, The injustice may find itself unpunished. That was worst of all. Justice needed a vessel for deliverance. Deborah downed the whole glass of whiskey and poured herself another. The nerves around that realization were too tender. She couldn't hover there for long. After the second glass had been drunk in more deep, frenetic thought, Deborah knew she couldn't stay in the apartment. Doing nothing did nothing to calm her mind, and the hollowness of what Adam took and Shaylee left behind wounded her. Whenever she felt this kind of pain, her instincts buried her in work. Without that outlet, she saw how far she'd run from the rest of the world. Deborah raised the bottle of whiskey and inspected it, trying to remember what had compelled her to buy it. She liked whiskey, of course, but she tried to remember why she'd bought this bottle, what had drawn her to this brand. She stared and stared, and was at last defeated. There was nothing, as far as she could tell. Deborah concluded that it had been an impulse, and that she was paying for it now. She didn't like it very much. Nevertheless, she drank another glass. The sound so shocked Deborah that she almost fell off the couch. She reached for her rifle, but all she found were coasters and the remote control at her fingertips. Panic set in because she didn't have her rifle, and there was enemy fire so close. Her hand reached out farther, so far out that now she did fall off the couch, and she couldn't find her rifle. Deborah froze. That wasn't gunfire at all. This wasn't Afghanistan. This was her apartment in Washington State, 7,000 miles away from Kabul, and that was the sound of the heaviest knock she'd ever heard in her life. She heaved a sigh and rubbed her face, ran her fingers through her hair, and groaned as she used the couch arm to hoist herself onto her feet. Deborah winced. Christ, it was the kind of knock she'd use when she was about to search a place with a warrant. "Shut the fuck up, I'm coming!" Maybe it was Freddie coming to beg for her forgiveness. And if it was, he'd picked a hell of a time. According to the microwave, it was 2:30 in the morning. Maybe he was just getting around to it after following up on a lead Thatcher had extracted from that Bartu cockroach. The knocking enraged Deborah now. She scowled and flung the chain lock off the track, slapped the deadbolt open, and flung open the door. Rage was deepened by confusion. "Who the fuck are you?" The slender man looked like he'd walked off a fashion runway. Sculpted face, blonde hair slicked back, purple shirt open at the collar under a leather blazer. Winking, he raised a revolver and cocked it. It looked out of place in his manicured hands. "Come on, Miss Samson. Let's go." The man who grabbed Deborah was bigger than the one with the gun, and he was strong. He gripped her arms too tightly, and she roared and kicked, but he lifted her off the ground and slammed her against the wall a few times. Deborah's head hit it hard, and she saw stars. Her limbs flailed out with weak, ineffective strikes. She could feel her heels bouncing off the stairs, and soon they were in the open air, and her wits were coming back to her. The pretty boy seemed to notice. He gestured for the big guy to stop, and he shoved the barrel of the revolver in her mouth as she opened it to scream. Peaches wants you alive so he can kill you himself, but he wants you dead either way, so don't make our jobs any harder, bitch. Deborah gagged on the barrel but stared down the pretty boy. After a few tense seconds, he pulled the gun out of her mouth. Deborah called his bluff and screamed. Pretty boy cracked her on the head with the butt of the pistol. The stars erupted before her eyes again, and she lost track of things because the next thing she knew, she was gagged and sitting between two more men in the back seat of a car. Deborah tried to lash out, but her hands and ankles were handcuffed. The two men put their hands on her, pushing her back down into the seat, and Pretty Boy turned around to look at her from the front passenger seat. He pointed the revolver at her again. You don't listen good. Sit down and shut up. Last call. I had a real shitty day, and I don't want to be here. And the last thing I need is some upstart, perpetually menstruating mega bitch RoboCop to make it worse. I know it's hard for you to understand because your brain is so small, but I have been very nice and patient with you. So this is it. Last chance. I'll even say please. He pulled back the hammer on his gun. Please sit down and shut the fuck up. Deborah glared, but she could see that Pretty Boy wasn't bluffing this time. His scowl was the crescent moon of a tired man who had run out of patience. She would create an opportunity later. No doubt Peaches would want to take his time. Deborah closed her eyes, took a few breaths, and then observed her surroundings to orient herself. They weren't heading to Peaches' complex. They were headed away from Peaches' territory, towards the Friends' turf. What was Peaches thinking? Big Guy pulled the car up to the cemetery on 10th, stealing a glance at Deborah through the rear view mirror while Pretty Boy got out and opened the rear passenger door. He gestured with his gun, and the goon got out. Pretty Boy reached in to take hold of Deborah, but she was already on her way, sliding across the seat to the open door, glare still trained on Pretty Boy. A constant challenge, perpetual dare. Once she was out, the goon who had been sitting next to her unlocked the cuffs around her feet. Pretty Boy used the revolver to direct her where he wanted her. Walk, he growled, jabbing the barrel deeper into her back. Deborah obliged. The cemetery was dark and quiet, surrounded by houses. St. Paul's loomed ahead, its spire peeking like a nosy neighbor over the raised skeletal hands of the trees. The four of them, Deborah, Big Guy, Pretty Boy, and Goon number 3, lit up against the white, molting snow, but it was late, and nobody was looking. Deborah was glad she'd fallen asleep in her clothes. It was cold. She hadn't had the opportunity to put shoes on, though, and her bare feet slipped on the slick, refrozen upper crust of snow while the goons around her crunched steadily through it. Peaches waited for them at the center of the cemetery, perched like a bony raven atop a gravestone. He turned his head and watched them approach. Where his face should be was an ugly amalgamation of deformities. The entire landscape had been altered. His once smooth forehead was now a series of hills and valleys. His cheekbones, once lovely in their tiptoe symmetry, were now cockeyed, one pointing up and the other sagged like a deflated balloon. His chin was the same jagged, irregular shape of an arrowhead. Expressionless, Deborah relished her handiwork, taking vicious pride in the fact that, were she to be executed tonight, she would have earned it. She could leave the world with one fewer regret than she had had a few hours ago. Peaches didn't get off the tombstone when they arrived. He chose to remain seated on the top, his soles pressed against the name of the deceased. Deborah thought she could make out Fava between his feet. Beside the Fava grave, a fresh one had been dug. It was unmarked. The tombstone hadn't yet been installed. Deborah knew where this was going. Peaches' gaze went up and down her body, inspecting her with loathsome curiosity, but he didn't speak. It was unusual, Deborah mused, because this normally would have been the part of the show where Peaches started gloating. At last, he completed his inspection of her and smiled. The parted lips revealed a mouth full of wires and rubber bands. Deborah stifled her own smile. Breaking Peaches' jaw had apparently been the only way to shut him up. The up-and-coming gangster king retrieved a folded sheet of paper from his jacket, passing it over to Pretty Boy without removing his leer from Deborah. The grim smile faded from his distorted face, but his eyes remained unchanged, still gleaming with the roguish brutality they always bore. The crunch of snow cracked the brief silence as Big Guy forced Deborah to her knees. Goon number 3 joined him in holding her shoulders. Their fingers dug into her hard. Pretty Boy unfolded the paper and cleared his throat. Debbie, sad, sorry little Debbie. Debbie, the sister of a whore, the failed mother, the abandoned daughter, the... Pretty Boy stopped here and furrowed his brow, apparently struggling with a word. After a few false starts, he continued. The abandoned daughter, the rejected detective, it seems that you've already fallen so far from grace that there is little more that I could do to you which might bring you lower. And while it would torment you greater to simply let you live, my thirst for vengeance must be slacked. Deborah assumed that Pretty Boy meant slaked. She didn't correct him. He continued. It should come as no surprise that I hate you, Samson, although when recent events are taken into consideration, it appears that I am not the only one. You are not the shield of justice that you consider yourself to be. You are only a bandit. You deserve a pauper's death and a stolen grave. Pretty Boy cast a glance at his boss, his face searching for approval with the spotlight. But Peaches didn't so much as give him a nod. Peaches gestured with his hand, and in response, Big Guy and Goon number 3 hauled Deborah to her feet. She saw the opportunity to manufacture a chance. Hands still cuffed, she launched herself at Big Guy, hoping to knock him off balance with the surprise. She was successful in pushing him off kilter, but it was only enough to get him anywhere but a few stumbling steps. Goon number 3 tried to compensate, attempting to lift Deborah off the ground like Big Guy had at the apartments, but Deborah kicked his knee hard enough to elicit a sharp, brief squawk of pain. He let go of her to bend and clutch the knee, and Deborah tried another blow with her own knee to his nose. With a crack and a groan, it struck true. For a single, triumphant moment, Deborah felt invincible. big guy wrapped one arm around her legs and another around her torso, binding her arms between her back and his stomach. He hoisted her off the ground and made his way to the foot of the empty grave. Deborah didn't make it easy for him. She flopped and flailed and kicked, tried to dig her fingers into Big Guy's stomach, and screamed for help against the gag in her mouth. She managed to get him to stumble once and tried to lean into the fall, but he righted himself again. Pretty Boy came to his rescue and hit her with the revolver again. It didn't make her pass out, but it was enough to stun her until Big Guy got to the grave. Then there was gunfire. Deborah's heart stopped. She thought for certain her vision went black, but pain spread through her body, and it was seconds after the first gunshot when she heard more. There was shouting, too, and she remembered hearing once that the brain stays alive 3 minutes after death. But as the pop of gunfire continued and her bearings recovered, it came to Deborah that she was in the grave. The pain came from being dropped, not from being shot. The darkness around her was the soil, and she looked up to see, peeking through the black fingers of trees, the faded gray nighttime clouds illuminated by street lamps. The shock of being alive passed, and Deborah pushed against the pain in her back to stand. Without her hands, there was little hope of climbing out, but she tried anyway. Above, the popping of small-caliber gunfire slowed, and Deborah thought she heard muffled screaming as if it were being done through clenched teeth. On her fourth attempt to scale the grave, she managed to pull herself halfway up, but she fell on her back again, and the pain was enough to immobilize her. Deborah glared at the patch of sky above her, flared her nostrils, and waited for pain to subside. The slowing gunfire ceased completely, along with the shouting. The muffled screaming faded away. Deborah listened to the steady crunch of one set of footprints approaching the grave, and then, in the dim gray window of its mouth, a dark figure looked down upon her. "What the fuck did you do to piss Peaches off so bad?" It took some time, but Deborah returned to the surface with the stranger's help. The first thing he did when she stood up straight was smile. What a smile. And he extended his hand to her. "My name's Johnny. Johnny Fava." Of course, Deborah already knew that. She'd seen his face, grimacing a mugshot after being booked, pinned on a corkboard with red yarn connecting him to Cosmo Carnevale, who in turn was connected to Lou Greaves. Yes, she'd heard of Johnny Fava. Johnny the Bean. Deborah shook his hand and offered him an uncertain smile in return. His grin was firm, and his hands were a little rough in a way that added pleasant friction to the shake. "What'd they name you?" The question brought her back down to earth despite its strangeness. "Deborah." Johnny smiled again, and even under the circumstances, Deborah was starting to get used to it. "Nice to meet you, Deborah." Deborah gave her own awkward smile and pointed at the road. "I'm going to go home now. It's been a really long night, and Peaches didn't give me enough time to put on shoes." Johnny looked down at her feet and made a surprised sound. "Whew. Oh, holy shit, you must be freezing." "Yeah. Come on, let me give you a ride, sugar." He put a light, guiding hand on her shoulder and jerked his head in the direction of the parking lot. "I want to hear how you got into this mess anyway." Deborah bristled at the touch, but choosing to refuse Johnny's offer seemed foolish. "Okay, but don't call me sugar." Johnny squinted and frowned. Huh? His tone was arched, as if he genuinely didn't understand the request. Don't call me Sugar, and I'll let you give me a ride. Johnny balked and cocked an eyebrow. Holy shit, you got some attitude on your chin, don't you? Is that a problem? I'll call a cab. Oh, yeah? With what phone? Deborah grimaced. Fuck it. I'll try not to call you Sugar. It's a habit, though, so don't jump down my throat if I don't. You better tell me how you wound up in that hole, though. He walked away with the powerful, deliberate swagger of someone who knew what he was doing, or at least believed he did, at all times. He held his spine straight and tall, his shoulders back and his chin out, all of this done seemingly without any conscious effort. It was a little frightening to be put in the casual presence of such a person. It begged the question, did Johnny know who Deborah was? She worked homicide, and as far as she knew, Johnny hadn't murdered anybody. However, she was reconsidering the reliability of her knowledge. Mob murders often went undetected in the city. It was only when someone threw one of their own under the bus that they were ever caught. So if he knew she was a cop, what was he doing? What was his angle? Was she still in danger? He drove a black Nissan that was stained along the bottom by rock salt laid down on the roads. Johnny got around a lot, apparently. It was parked on the close edge of the lot, and Johnny sped ahead of her, opened the passenger side door, and gestured cordially for her to enter. Deborah hurried over the snow and slipped inside the car. Johnny closed the door and got into the other side. Let's get it warm in here, huh? He gave another one of his grins, and the Nissan shivered to life. He asked her where to take her. Deborah hesitated for a moment, realizing for the first time that she'd be letting a known gangster become aware of where she lived. But after only a moment, she told him the address. Peaches wasn't that smart or resourceful, and he'd managed to figure it out. If, for some reason, Johnny's crew wanted to find her, they would, with or without the ride. Anyway, she wasn't about to walk 10 fucking miles barefoot in the snow in the early hours of the morning. She was over it. Let them come and kill her while she slept. Let her be done with it. Johnny nodded when she gave him the address. Now it's time for your end of the bargain. He put the Nissan into drive and backed it out of the spot, then pulled onto the empty street. He caught Deborah's confused, slightly disgusted expression because he flashed her another smile, this one the most amused of all he'd given her, and perhaps all the better for it. The story, he explained. Deborah sighed, hesitating once more. Johnny clucked his tongue. Look, I know who you are, just like I'm sure you know me. As far as I'm concerned tonight, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. My crew and me have been going toe-to-toe with Peaches for years. It'll be nice to have him out of commission for a while. He glanced at her, assessing her reaction. You're not in danger. I'm just curious. What were you doing in the cemetery? Quid pro quo. He bobbed his head. Good question. Let's just say I was asking a wise man for some advice. At 3 a.m? What can I say? You got weird hours in my line of work. Deborah watched him for about a block, watched how the alternating bands of light and darkness illuminated and hid his face as they went. His hands were steady on the wheel, and his eyes fixed on the road. Something about him, besides the obvious things, spoke to her. She saw, reflected in him, pieces of herself, as if she were looking into shards of a mirror. Maybe I was in the wrong place at the wrong time, Maybe he thought I was someone else. No, I don't buy it. Peaches is a sick motherfucker and he sucks a lot of dick, but that doesn't make him stupid. Johnny shook his head and wagged his finger. Nah, Peaches doesn't make that kind of mistake. She told him. Most of it, at least. She left out the part where she orchestrated the raid on Johnny's crew, and she left out the key details of why she had visited Peaches in the first place, but she left the rage and the violence intact. The story pleased Johnny. His eyes grew wide and his smile turned sharp as she described the beating. When she finished, he shook his head and chuckled. Holy shit, Sugar. You're my new favorite person. Don't call me Sugar. The Nissan found a spot on the curb in front of Deborah's apartment, and Johnny threw the car into park. This it? Yeah, thanks. Her hand hovered on the handle for a moment before she pulled it open, and when she got out, the ground against her feet seemed even colder than it had been at the cemetery. She got to the entrance of the complex and tried to turn the doorknob. It didn't move. Deborah hung her head back on her shoulders and whispered a soft "fuck" into the gray sky. There a problem? It's locked. No keys? It wasn't exactly a planned trip. The Nissan went quiet. Johnny's door creaked open and then barked shut, reverberating across the silent street. Beside her, Johnny checked down the sidewalk, one way and then the other, his tongue probing the inside of his cheek. With a nod, he said, "Looks like everything's clear." Deborah gave him a puzzled look. What? Johnny withdrew a slim leather pouch from his jacket. When he opened it, a set of picks and tension wrenches winked in the dull streetlight. He made quick work of the lock with the set and opened it wide for Deborah. With that goddamned grin, he chirped, "Have a good night." Quietly, Deborah replied, "Thank you." She held the door open and watched as he walked back to the car. "Hey." Her voice caught in her throat. "I'm not technically a cop right now. You want to come inside for a coffee or something?" The rich scent of black Colombian coffee filled the entire apartment like a warm blanket. She filled a mug for Johnny and herself and set them down on the kitchen table. Johnny took the mug and thanked her. "You, got any cream?" "No. We drink coffee straight here." "We?" "My father and I." "No boyfriend?" "Fuck off, Johnny. It's not happening." She raised the whiskey bottle to the mug and poured it in before topping it off with coffee. It was more than she realized. Johnny blew on his coffee and took a sip. What's your story, huh?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, how does a girl like you end up with some mean Rambo streak?" Deborah raised her eyebrows while she sipped. "What do you mean, a girl like me?" Johnny shrugged. I don't know. I mean any girl. How does a girl end up curb stomping Peach's jaw like that?" Deborah's raised brow flattened into a simmering glower. Johnny choked on his coffee and put the mug down to raise both hands. I mean no offense. It just doesn't happen where I'm from." "I'm from here." "Look, it's unusual for anyone who isn't hustling, and there aren't a lot of girls who hustle like I mean." Deborah knew what he meant. She understood, but she wanted to bust his balls for the sake of it. She considered how much to tell him and settled on the simple, distant answer she usually reached for, which typically satisfied. I was a soldier. Johnny leaned back in his seat and nodded knowingly. Yeah, that explains a lot. He scratched his cheek and nodded again. That answers a lot of questions. They both drank a little coffee in the ensuing silence. Then Johnny finally said, It doesn't stop, does it? What doesn't? The soldier thing. Being a soldier. No, I guess not. It can for some people, but not always. It's in you, Johnny said, sitting up and tapping his wrist. It's in your blood. Maybe you're not born with it, or fuck, I don't know. Maybe you are, but either fucking way, it's there. It's there inside you. It is you. The fight. The war is still waged in your gut. Deborah looked at the man sidelong. It bothered her how much sense his little speech made. It was unsettling that he could give words to feelings she'd had ever since she came back, feelings that were shared, apparently, by no one else in the world. Not even Freddie. Johnny's words floated to a part of Deborah that had been drowning in an endless black ocean of cold isolation. The gangster spoke a lifeboat into existence. Who are you? You don't look like the kind of boy who'd enlist. Johnny thumbed his nose and seemed to settle on the question. I'm in a different kind of war. I guess I'm a different kind of soldier. She'd heard thugs talk to justify their behavior in terms like that before, and it was disappointing that he followed up his poignant observations with such a tired excuse. Though it let Deborah down, there was still something to it. He had reservations, like he was aware of the problem in his explanation, but couldn't find another way to express it. Maybe he was looking for someone to give him the words for the part of himself, the same way Deborah had been looking for his. They went through the pot of coffee as they talked about war. The whiskey had spread warm and comforting over Deborah's body, relaxing her, loosening her. It felt nice. This was nice. Johnny admitted that it was his father that he'd come to see at the cemetery, who died in a shootout between gangs. Cosmo had been at the shootout, and by the brooding glint overtaking Johnny's eyes, that seemed to mean something which Deborah didn't understand. Deborah talked a little about Afghanistan, but only in the vague, practiced expressions she'd become familiar with deploying. It felt like a disservice. She felt compelled to tell him more, but didn't know how. When Johnny talked about the first time he'd shot someone, Deborah was shocked. Not that he'd shot someone, she saw in his hands that he'd always been capable of firing a gun, but rather she was shocked that she told him about the first firefight that she'd been in. She hadn't told Johnny about Freddie. She didn't imagine she would. She didn't want to think of that life, those relationships. She left him out of the story. Deborah talked about the IED and how it toppled the Humvee, how she'd been swept in a wave of chaos and emotion, and how they'd spent 10 minutes shooting. 10 minutes that felt like an hour. Were you a cop before? Before the war? Johnny nodded. She shook her head. I just wanted to get away from here. Deborah sipped her coffee and Johnny watched her. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it, then said, There's baggage with my sister. She poured another glass of whiskey and downed it quickly. Johnny declined. She shifted back. I've been back for 5 years, and over there stalked me home. I don't follow you. Deborah ran her fingers through her hair and scratched, averting her eyes. These guys, the ones that hit the Fred Meyer and the Target. Her eyes were down, so she couldn't tell precisely what, but something flickered in Johnny. She met his gaze. His eyes were solemn. What? Yeah. They're pretty messed up. Now it was Deborah's turn to wait for him to elaborate, and unlike her, he did. Deb, you're a pretty badass bitch, so they probably put you on that thing, right? Deborah winced, and Johnny noticed. You'd think they would have. Why? You were in the war and all of that. Deborah tapped her fingernails against the empty mug. Do you know who is? Who's what? On the case. Deborah examined Johnny. The carefree boy with war in his heart was gone. Sitting across her now was only the warrior. She asked, Why do you want to know? Johnny waved the question away. You know what? Forget about it. No. Deborah sipped her whiskey and then set it down. Tell me. He eyed her carefully. She could tell that he was running possibilities through his head, analyzing benefits and costs, wondering who precisely this woman was sitting across from him. He looked into his empty mug and frowned, then sighed. My boss wants me to find them. I was hoping maybe you could help me. There was silence again, and then, with deliberate slowness, Deborah replied, I don't think I can do that. Johnny glanced up and then immediately dropped his gaze again. I didn't really think so. It's too bad. We make a good team. And anyway, I'm sure you guys have almost got him. Deborah sucked in air and Johnny raised his eyebrows. Oh. You don't, huh? We have a man in custody. I caught him. A man, huh? A worm. Tell me how you got him. She did. It was against her better judgment, but only marginally so. There was nothing Johnny could do with the information, and she'd been wanting desperately to share her pride with someone else, someone who would appreciate what had happened and would remark upon how well she'd seized such a serendipitous opportunity. It was the single good break they'd gotten on the whole damn case, and all that had gotten her was a suspension. She told the story, and she liked how Johnny listened. She liked that it was 3 times now that she told a story about herself, and he hadn't shirked away from her, or chastised her, reprimanded her, abandoned her. Johnny was wrapped with awe, and Deborah fantasized that it was the first time he'd ever talked to a cop and liked it. She liked that he grinned at the times she wanted him to, and she loved that at the end he said, "Good fucking work, girl. I hope the motherfucker gets a bullet in his skull." Deborah shook her head. "He'll go to prison. They all will, for the rest of their lives." You really believe that? I want to. She fidgeted with the mug in her hands as she leaned against the counter. I have to. There was silence for a time. It was quiet and comfortable, but cold and pregnant. You know what I'm gonna do if I catch him first? Deborah nodded. She could only guess. Johnny answered anyway. I'm gonna tie them to a chair, Debbie. Every one of them. I'm gonna start with their second in command, not the leader. See, I got a Louisville Slugger I keep in the trunk. I can show it to you if you want. It used to be a nice light tan, but now it's red and pink. Now I'm gonna take that Slugger, and I'm gonna start at his feet. I'm gonna ask him questions he can't answer. Sometimes I'm gonna ask him questions that don't make any sense. You know why I'm gonna do that? Make him think he has a chance. Deborah was keenly aware of her quickening heart. Johnny smiled and nodded. Every time he answers, no matter what he says, I'll break something. I'll keep going until he flops around like a dead fucking squid, Deb. Then what are you gonna do? Her slickening fingers traced easy circles on the side of the ceramic mug. What I'm gonna do, I'm gonna let him fucking dangle in that chair like a rag doll while I move on to the next one. You're gonna do the same thing to all of them? Absolutely not. It's gonna be a little different for everyone. What if you run out of ideas? Sugar, I never run out of ideas. Deborah didn't correct the nickname. Her breath came heavier. She sucked in a slow, deep stream of air through her nose, trying to keep quiet, but her mouth filled with viscous, molten spit. She choked on it and coughed, clearing her throat and dropping her gaze from Johnny's. Johnny stood with his mug and went around the breakfast bar to Deborah's side. Doesn't that sound better than what they're gonna do if you catch him? He put a hand on her shoulder. She stiffened at first, surprised by the sudden proximity of touch, but ultimately leaned into it. Johnny continued, a hand on each of her shoulders now, kneading into the flesh with his thumbs and fingertips. I know what happens in prison, Deborah. These guys, they're gonna do great in prison. It's gonna barely be a punishment for them. Johnny had strong hands. There was so much tension in her shoulders. The whiskey and the massage wore away at it, melting it, softening her. Deborah groaned before she realized the sound was in her throat. She thought about Johnny's promise. She thought about the tiny outline in Fred Meyer. She thought about Shaylee. The fortress drawbridges went up, and she shut the memories out. She leaned back into Johnny's chest. The truth was, she felt safe with Johnny. she felt seen. As if he'd read her mind, Johnny leaned close to her ear and whispered, "You did good, Deb. I guess you're not a cop right now because of all that, and that's a goddamn shame, you know. You did the right thing. They're over there reaping the fruit of your glory, and you're the one catching shit. You did the right thing. You ought to know that." Eyes closed, Deborah's heart fluttered. She told herself it was the whiskey. A slight smile softened the perpetual scowl. Deborah felt like she couldn't remember the last time she really smiled. She put a hand on his fingers. "Yeah, I do know that." Johnny bent down and kissed her temple. Deborah murmured and moved her hand up to his face, then stroked his hair. She knew it wasn't right, knew it would cause problems if anyone found out, but now she was beyond caring. After so much sacrifice and struggle, it was time for Deborah to feel good. It was time for her to get something back. They looked into each other's eyes, then kissed. Deborah's hunger surprised her. She knew she could blame it on the drinks, on the stress of her situation, on the hole of frustration she found herself in, but when she was honest with herself, she knew that this crash was a long time coming. Things were changing, and she didn't understand them anymore, so she chose to turn off her mind, let down the walls of her mental fortresses, and embrace something that seemed to embrace her back. Until he kissed her, she hadn't realized how lonely she was. It wasn't just that he was a man, and it wasn't just that she liked to taste the coffee on his tongue and smell his cologne. They looked into each other's eyes and saw themselves looking back. Not just in reflection, but in mimicry of form, too. Deborah had, at least. Maybe Johnny hadn't. When he slipped his hand under her shirt and she shuddered at his touch, she decided she didn't care. Deborah would take this lifeboat in the dark, even if it didn't last longer than a night. Johnny was attentive to her responses. If he pulled too hard, he stopped and loosened his grip. If he held too meekly, his grip tightened. They communicated through touch without words. Afterwards, they didn't speak for a while. She lay on him and thought about how nice it was to be understood. Deborah rested her head on his chest and traced patterns over the lines of his torso. Some of the lines were carved from muscle. Others were sallow white lines of old scars. Others were jagged and discolored. They almost looked like the scars. Deborah knew they weren't. She had them too. Stretch marks. Beneath her cheek, Johnny tightened and shifted almost imperceptibly. Yeah. He said the words like the marks were nothing, and they were. It was true, but still, Johnny said it as if he were aware they weren't supposed to be anything. Spread beneath Deborah, the man had become a minefield. He continued, cocking his trademark grin. Believe it or not, sugar, I used to be a fat kid. Johnny shifted, craning his neck to make eye contact with Deborah. I bet you don't believe it, huh? I mean, I sure ain't winning any Mr. Universe contests anytime soon, but let me tell you, sugar, I was huge. He slipped his hands out from under his head and gestured a suggestion of roundness with them. They called me Johnny Bean. He shook his head. Johnny the fucking Bean. Can you believe that shit? It stuck, too. They still call me that. Deborah watched his Adam's apple bob in his throat. I was a fat kid, too. I believe it. No shit. Johnny's face lit up. Deborah laughed. Total shit. I was never a big girl. I always worked too hard. Beneath her, the minefield dissipated, softening into flesh, blood, and man once more. His hand found her hair and he stroked and stared at nothing with the vacancy of someone who is right there at the moment, lost in the sensation of now. I like your hair, Deb. I like how soft it is. It's strong. Strong like you. How do you know I'm strong? You caught that motherfucker, remember?
Johnny, December 14th, 2024.
Johnny didn't really sleep. He'd lain in the bed with her arm draped across his chest and her breasts pressed against his side, his mind racing, tingling with excitement enhanced by the buzz of fresh sex. Of all the ways. He couldn't believe his luck. He'd found a lead. For once in his life, a dumb decision was really paying off. Johnny stroked Deborah's arm and sightlessly traced patterns in the popcorn ceiling. The man they'd caught, the one who'd insisted on being called Bartu, was just within reach. Johnny'd collar the son of a bitch, pass him over to Cosmo, and whether or not Mr. Greaves still controlled the Friends in a year or not would be irrelevant. Johnny Bean would forever be remembered as that cocksucker who showed the world that you didn't mess with their side of the city. He'd be the guy who took shots at Peaches, fucked a cop, laid down the law, and stayed true to the Friends. He'd be remembered. He'd be like a legend. Never again would he be Johnny the Bean. Deborah smacked her lips in her sleep as she rolled off of him to the other side of the bed, her back to him. There wasn't much light from the city reflected into the room, but it was enough for him to make out her silhouette. With hungry vision, he traced the line of her shoulder down to the line of her waist, then followed the upward curve of her hips and then back down the slope of her legs until they disappeared completely in the shapeless, bundled sheets. She was a pretty girl. He even liked her. But he had work to do. Johnny slipped out of bed with the silence of a specter, scooped his clothes up from the floor with equal skill, and exited the room as if he were never there at all. Slipping into his underwear and jeans outside the door, Johnny put his shirt on in the kitchen as he put coffee on to brew. When he replaced the lid on the tin, he checked the brand. It was good coffee. He'd have to get some. The machine grumbled louder than he'd anticipated, so he scribbled the note out on a scrap of paper he'd found, hoping it wasn't anything important. Johnny replaced the pen, patted his pockets to ensure he had everything, and then slipped out of the apartment. It had snowed even more in the night, and the fresh layer coating the sidewalk made a dull crunch with every step. Johnny stopped by McDonald's and bought a coffee with cream and sugar, then added a hash brown at the last minute. The coffee was hot, but it wasn't very good. It made him yearn for a cup of Deborah's. He drank it and ate the hash brown as he drove back to his little apartment. He finished the hash brown before he got there. It was okay. It did the job. That was all it was supposed to do. Nurtured by the measly breakfast, Johnny set his mind to scheming. He didn't even bother checking his watch before digging a burner phone out from behind the spatula and wooden mixing spoon in the kitchen drawer and then dialing his old friend at the department. Like a dog, Kennedy would come when called. It rang 3 times, and Johnny's brow flared with aggravation when he thought that Kennedy might dare let it go to voicemail. Just as he expected to hear the robotic voice announce that Kennedy couldn't be reached, the ringing stopped. Dull anticipation hung in the couple of seconds after, but the dog's sleepy groan broke it.
This is Kennedy.
Johnny explained the situation to the cop. Explained exactly what he wanted, like ordering takeout. The one called Bar 2. Move him to an isolated cell. Make sure that he's cleared for visitation. Allow Johnny, and only Johnny, to come see him. Between commands, Kennedy gave monosyllabic grunts to confirm his understanding. At the end, Johnny felt so good about the whole thing that he couldn't help himself. And he told Kennedy, "That lousy shit was in on the Fred Meyer thing. You're doing the city and all of humanity a favor here, Kennedy." The officer was quiet. Johnny shook his head and hoped he never got to be so dumb when he was old and fat. "Hey, Kennedy, you hear me? You understand what you got to do?" Almost as if he'd been broken out of a reverie, the officer replied,
Yeah, Johnny, I understand. Crystal clear.
He hung up. Johnny held the phone away from his face with disgust. One day he'd put that little shit in his place. Thank you for sharing my nightmares and helping me carry the grief. If this episode left a mark, do me a favor. Pass it along to someone who deserves to lose a little sleep. Subscribe, leave a comment, tell me what's keeping you up. You can support the show on Patreon for early episodes and a look at what goes into building these nightmares. My books are on Amazon. Links are below. Thank you for sharing this time with me. Good night.